اما کنفرانس رو با سخنران دوم استفان سیچووسکی دبیر کل شورای کارگری ونکوور و هومه ادامه میدیم. امیدوارم در اتاق حاضر باشن. استفان سیچووسکی, you are the next speaker of this conference. If you hear me, please take the microphone.
Thank you very much. Good morning, comrades, and happy International Workers' Day. My name is Stefhen Sychowdki, and I'm the president of the Vancouver and District Labour Council. I'm joining today from the unceded territory of the Katzie and Kwantlen First Nations in Maple Ridge, British Columbia, Canada. I want to start off, of course, by thanking Faridim Now for inviting me to speak briefly today. I wish I could stay for the whole conference. I do unfortunately have a conflicting commitment with our political action work coming up shortly here, but I'm really glad to be here and to see you all joining together today, gathering safely to mark International Workers' Day. Throughout the pandemic, no matter what circumstances we face, workers all across the world have found ways to take action to mark this important day, and I'm glad that that's happening again this year. Although we are seeing more activities returning to in person, we know that the pandemic is not over. And when I say this, I'm not just talking about the virus and the health risks, but but also the fact rather than keeping workers safe, many governments around the world are instead focused on using the pandemic as an opportunity for cracking down on those who fight for workers' rights and for their safety, and finding ways to make sure that workers, not bosses, pay for the pandemic. We know that the government of Iran is one of these, and we have followed the repression of labor and human rights activists throughout this period. The unjust imprisonment of activists has put them at risk, of course, greater risk to COVID-19 exposure, and the inhumane treatment of prisoners, including floggings, torture, and executions, are unacceptable and must end. But workers are fighting back, as we heard and as we saw in the video just then. And I'm thinking of recent strikes and rallies of teachers, of truck drivers, oil workers, for example. And of course, this gives us great hope. Despite tremendous risks, workers are joining together and fighting back. And the truth that I think the government doesn't understand, and many governments across the world, including in Iran, fail to understand, is that you can't end working class movement through repression. These movements spring from the exploitative conditions that workers face and will always continue to do so as long as those conditions exist. And so despite the repression that we face, we see these movements continue and grow. Here in Canada, of course, the situation is somewhat different for unions. Unions are legal, and although interference in their rights is not uncommon, and violence and arrests and even murders targeting union organizers and leaders were by no means unheard of in the past. Thankfully, they are uncommon now. We don't face the same brutal repression that our fellow workers in Iran do face on a daily basis. However, our capitalists, in their own way, are and their political representatives are still finding their own ways to make workers pay for the pandemic. One of these is through a skyrocketing cost of living, which pads corporate profits and shelters them from the effects of the pandemic, downloading those costs to workers. This has been especially true in terms of costs of housing, groceries, and fuel. Another facet of this strategy is to pursue an austerity agenda, which seeks to cut programs and services that working people and their families and communities rely upon in order to reduce corporate taxes, another form of transferring wealth from public to private hands. So our fight over the next couple of years is very much going to be about what our society will look like post-pandemic. And May Day is a reminder, I think, that all workers across our planet are part of one global class. Worker in Iran and a worker in Canada might face different struggles, might live a very different life, but will always ultimately have more in common with one another than they can ever have with their bosses. VDLC sends greetings of solidarity to the workers of Iran, solidarity in their fight for a better future, which is our common fight. And thank you very much for the important work of Freedom Now, and keeping us up to date and including us in those initiatives. We're very glad to be part of that, and we know that the work you're doing is making a real difference. Thank you again for having me here today. Long live international solidarity. Long live May Day.
Thank you, Stefan, for your speech. تحمیل میخوام به تو برگردم. امیدوارم نکاتی رو یادداشت کرده باشی برای مخاطبین فارسی زبان برنامه. دوست دارم اگر یادداشت کردی مهمترین نکاتی که استفان بهش اشاره کرد رو به بینندگان اشاره بهش داشته باشی.
دوستان، استفان در مورد شرایط وضعیت طبقه کارگر تو ایران صحبتایی رو کردن و ایشون متوجه هستن که کارگران تو قشرهای مختلف در اعتصاب و اعتراض هستن و ایشون ابراز همبستگی خودشون رو با اعتراضات و اعتصابات کارگران تو ایران اعلام کردن و همچنین گفتن طبقه کارگر در کانادا هم وضعیت خوبی نداره، ولی حداقل یه سری حقوق پایه‌ای رو داره و اونم حق اعتراض و اعتصاب هست و ایشون امیدوارن که با یک همبستگی بین‌المللی بتونیم این شرایط رو برای طبقه کارگر جهانی از ایران تا جاهای دیگه تغییر بدیم و به خصوص ایشون اعلام همبستگی کردن با جنبش کارگری در ایران. این خلاصه صحبتی بود که ایشون کردن.